Hello and welcome to the Canine orientation for Pets in Need, the both Redwood City and Palo Alto locations. My name is Anna Marie Johnson. I am the Shelter Operations Manager for the Palo Alto shelter, but I oversee the behavior department for both shelters. A little bit about me. I grew up in the Bay Area, grew up in Daly City and living back there. I always envisioned myself as an academic. I always loved animals, but I didn't think I wanted to be anything like a vet, and I knew that didn't really interest me. So as a result, I didn't think there was really anything else I could do in the animal field. I volunteered with cats as the SFSPCA when I was in high school, and then I went off to UC Davis as a classics major. I thought I was going to do history of medicine, and I ended up switching my major then to science and technology studies and evolutionary anthropology. And I was totally on that track to be a PhD academic. And then I did an internship in DC, and I had my brother come out and visit me, and I was reminiscing about what my future might be, about having dogs and cats and rabbits and all the kind of good things. And my brother just nicely asked, "How do you expect to do that when you have an actual job?" Which gave me a little bit of realization and pause. So I ended up reaching out to the rescue organization, the Yola County SPCA that I volunteered with, and they happened to be having a job opening. So I ended up being the volunteer and outreach coordinator for the Yola County SPCA for about 5 years. That was during college and after college. And then I became interested in the behavior aspect of animal welfare and animal sheltering world. I did an internship or volunteered with a trainer in Davis. And then I decided that I wanted to get more in depth. So moved across country with my husband and those 2 dogs you see in the middle, Velvet and Bailey, and moved to New York City. And I ended up getting my master's in animal behavior and conservation from Hunter College. And we were there for about 4 years. Most of my formative years in New York City, I actually was a private dog trainer. You can see the 2 dogs on either side here are 2 of my clients that I had in New York City. And so I did training from puppy kindergarten to adolescence, to training dogs with problems, to separation anxiety, to aggression, to all of that. While I was doing private training, I also helped do some per diem work with the ASPCA, both at their adoption facility as well as their behavior rehab center. So I kept my feet in the shelter world, and I knew I wanted to come back. So moved back to the Bay Area, and I've been with Pets in Need for a little over a year, doing shelter operations and managing the behavior department. So what can you expect from this orientation? So generally speaking, you're going to get a better understanding of how dogs learn, which is really important when you're working with animals here at the shelter. You're going to receive some basics of training, learn how to read dog body language, how we want you to interact with the dogs at PIN, and then you'll get kind of a breakdown of the different volunteer opportunities that we have at Pets in Need for both facilities. So to start us off, so this says how dogs learn, but generally speaking, this is how dogs, cats, rabbits, monkeys, humans, bugs, fish, anything learn. There's basically 2 different sides. There's classical conditioning, which is what we always think about when you think about Pavlov and the ringing of the bell. I kind of think of it as kind of experiential learning. You're not really required to do anything beyond just experiencing the stimuli that are coming at you. So if you remember back to the Pavlovian conditioning, you remember that the dogs started salivating when they heard the bell. And there was no prior reason that there should have been an association between the bell and the salivation. It's just that Pavlov, who was actually not even studying behavioral theory, had happened to randomly pair the sound of a bell with the presentation of food. And so over time, he started realizing that prior to the food even being presented, the animals were having a response to the sound of the bell. So this is really important to think about in a shelter environment, because it really ties into that every single thing that we have, interaction that we have with our animals, has some type of associative learning that is connected to it. I had a number of clients in New York City that would see a harness, the dog would have a harness on them. They would present the harness and the dog would run away. And the owners would come up to tell me and they would say, "I don't understand. Why is the dog running away? It likes going on a walk." And so I had to explain to them, I said, well, think about walking in New York City. It's not a very, pleasurable experience for humans, and continually, it's not a very pleasurable experience for dogs. So while your puppy might enjoy getting out for a walk, relieving itself, going to the bathroom, and maybe seeing some dogs, it's also associating it with some scary sensations like garbage trucks, motorcycles, skateboards, all that kind of stuff. So just the presentation of the harness was now creating this kind of conflicted association for the animal between, oh, I kind of want to go outside, no, I don't. You can even think generally to different things that you do in your day-to-day life, right? I brush my teeth, my dogs start running to the back door because they know, oh, it's bedtime, we're doing our last going to the bathroom. All those kinds of things are classical conditioning that happens in our life. Common thing, walking to the door, saying walk, or holding a leash, that means the dog walks, it gets really excited. Operant conditioning is learning by consequence. It requires something on the animal in order to obtain the reward. So you can see here the dog and the rat are both thinking of the reward being the food, but they're going about it two different ways. The dog is just experiencing the whistle. The rat actually has to press a lever in order to obtain that. The rat could, technically speaking, be in that room for 20, 30 minutes, and it's not going to get any of the reward. It has to act upon it. So operant conditioning a lot is what we think about with our basic training that we do with animals. It's the training that happens, sorry, my door opened. It's the training that happens when you go to your basic training classes. So I sit, I get a treat. I lay down, I get a treat. I don't bark, I might get a treat, right? That's a little conflicted, but so that's that operant conditioning we think about when we think about quote unquote training our animals. So 4 quadrants of operant conditioning. This is a little bit somewhat in the weeds, but I think it's really important to discuss. I am a positive reinforcement trainer. Pets in Need is a positive reinforcement organization. We believe in positive reinforcement and force-free training. But what does that really mean? So positive reinforcement obviously kind of has a buzzy term in our media. A lot of people think about it. They think, oh, happy feelings, good thoughts, getting lots of treats. But really when you break it down in terms of the behavior learning theory, the use of positive and negative literally means addition or subtraction of something. And reinforcement and punishment means increasing the likelihood something is going to happen, or punishing, decreasing the likelihood something's going to happen. So when you combine those two words together, positive reinforcement means we're adding something rewarding to the animal in order to increase the likelihood the behavior is going to happen. I add a treat in order to increase the likelihood the dog is going to sit the next time I ask. Opposite end of the spectrum, you have positive punishment. You are adding something aversive to decrease the likelihood a behavior is going to happen. I do not want my dog to bark. I'm going to add a shock, an aversive, to decrease the likelihood that dog's going to bark in the future. Negative reinforcement, we're removing something aversive in order to increase the likelihood the behavior is going to happen. So sometimes people will teach recall work, which is, come behavior, with a shock collar. The dog runs away, there gets a shock. The moment the dog turns around and comes back into proximity, I'm releasing that shock. So the dog is likely going to stay in proximity to me in order to avoid that aversive in the future. Negative punishment sounds the worst of all of them, but it's actually highly used in the positive reinforcement force-free community. Negative punishment is really, at a basic concept, the idea of ignoring a dog. So a lot of times you have dogs or animals that use demand behaviors in order to get something from you. I enter the house, the dog jumps on me, it wants to get my attention. I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove myself. So essentially I enter the house, the dog jumps on me, I'm going to turn away, or I'm going to exit back out the door. That is really important, because the dog hopefully over time will realize that is not the jumping up behavior is not getting the reward that it necessarily wanted. It's actually removing the reward that an animal wanted. So dog jumps up, I ignore. The moment dog puts 4 on the floor, I'm going to positively reinforce that. I'm going to add my attention back to the animal in order to increase the likelihood the dog's going to keep 4 on the floor. So how do we build behaviors? How does the training actually happen when we want to train an animal? These are somewhat ranked in order of my preference, top being my least preferential. So physical manipulation. Could I have a dog sit by constantly pushing on its butt? Could I make a dog lay down by pulling down on its front legs? Yes, but that is not sustainable over time. I think a lot of people would be very irritated if they're going to have to manipulate their dog into positions over time. Similarly, it's not, one, force-free, and two, it's not really helping the dog in order to actually learn the behavior it's doing. The dog is basically being molded into it. Next level that you can build behaviors is luring. Luring is very common. That's kind of what everyone has always grown up with, right? Treat in the hand, hold it in front of the dog's nose. The dog's behavior is going to change. It's going to do something. It's going to go into a sit as it sees that treat above its head and it's lured into a down. Luring is definitely a usable way of getting that a basic behavior that you want, but there are a couple downfalls that happen to luring. One of which is you get that behavior that everyone always complains about is my dog only does the behavior when I have a treat in my hand. And yes, that is totally a reasonable reason not to use luring, right? If you're really only using the treat when the dog's only doing the behavior when you have the treat in hand, then yes, luring is going to be problematic because the dog is only going to learn that it only needs to do the behavior when the treat is in hand. You can learn how to fade, which a lot of trainers do use, but a lot of times the general public does not have those skills in hand. And primarily for me, one of the reasons I don't try to use luring as best as possible is because I want the dog to actually think things through. I kind of see luring as a reactionary behavior on the animal's part, right? It sees the treat, it smells the treat, and then it's kind of descending its butt down. It's not really thinking through why it's actually doing the behavior. Which brings us to capturing. This is more of my preferred method of how to actually build a behavior. So capturing is really just kind of waiting the dog out for it to do default behaviors that it would already naturally offer. We're thinking about sits, we're thinking about downs. For some dogs, it might be offering a paw or a handshake. And it's just waiting them out for those behaviors to happen on their own and rewarding them when they are offered. So a lot of times when I would talk to my puppy clients in New York City, I would tell them, you're going to sit on the couch, you're going to have some treats, and basically every time your dog randomly sits its butt down on the ground, you're going to give a treat. Over time, the dog's going to go, oh, that's a really easy behavior that I already do, and now I can get paid for it. Let me try that again. It's a really fun way to train because you kind of can see the cogs turning in their brain of thinking things through. Oh my God, I'm actually getting rewarded for this. Let's keep playing this game. So that's a really preferred method of doing that. But as I said, it's really only the default behaviors that a dog is naturally going to do. A dog is not naturally going to spin around in a circle and jump up 3 times. You can't necessarily capture that. So how you can actually build that behavior to completion for a complex behavior is what we call capturing by shaping, or shaping by approximation. So essentially you capture behaviors in little incremental steps, fading out the initial behavior before that until you get one complex behavior. Very common behavior that is shaped in the dog training world is going into a crate. A dog, likelihood says, is not going to naturally walk into a crate and lay down and be content. So what you do is you essentially shape that. First couple times, you're going to reward the dog for sticking its head in the crate. Then next couple times, it's going to be rewarding the dog for putting a paw in the crate. And then it's going to be next couple times, it's head and 2 paws in the crate until you actually get the completed behavior. And then at that point, you're not rewarding anything prior to that. Once the dog has already done 10 or 15 times or whatever arbitrary amount you want to set of the dog actually going into the crate into completion, you're no longer going to be rewarding for just walking to the crate and walking back out. So that's capturing by shaping. And that's how you can get more complex behaviors that you see positive reinforcement trainers do. So that brings us into marker and clicker training. So marker training and clicker training has been around in the world for a little bit of time. I do want to say a caveat that all clicker trainers are positive reinforcement. Not all positive reinforcement trainers are clicker trainers. Some positive reinforcement trainers will use just rewards. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're marking with clickers. And so clickers and marker training, it's essentially a really good way to provide consistency to the animal of the time point of the behavior that you wanted completed. I can totally teach a dog how to sit just by using treats and not having a marker reward, but sometimes it can confuse the dog in the time of when we're actually offering that treat, right? The dog sits down, we want to reward that, but by the time I actually deliver the treat after fumbling around in my pockets, the dog might have scratched its ear, so the dog might be getting confused as to why that treat was actually offered. The clicker kind of negates that point in which you're actually marking the behavior that you wanted, the object of the sit, and then you're rewarding a little bit past that. The clicker acts as what they call a bridge, right? It's saying time point A is the click of the behavior that you did. Time point B, a little bit of a gap time afterwards that has been bridged over, is the offering of the treat. And essentially, you're classically conditioning the arbitrary noise of a click. Could be a whistle, as you see in the aquatic world. It could be the word yes. It could be the word good. It could be the word pineapple. It doesn't matter. Essentially, you're classically conditioning the arbitrary noise to the eventually deliver of the treat. And over time, dogs get what we call clicker savvy. Essentially, the dog hears a click and they know that they've done something right and the click is coming. Clicker training is really important when you're initially building new behaviors for an animal. I have a 9 and a 7-year-old dog. I do not click them every time that they sit. They know sit, that is a sit behavior that is in their repertoire, and it's been a highly reinforced behavior. They continue to play the game of sitting when I ask them, because sometimes they get a treat, sometimes they get a pet, sometimes they get to go outside, right? But sometimes they don't. And so it's that variable reinforcement that is important to the dogs, the gambling that is variable reinforcement in our dogs' lives that continues to motivate them. So a really easy caveat or explanation I have for people of why we use clicker training and when we use clicker training and when, importantly, we deliver food is when we're building a new behavior, we're clicking all the time. We want those time points of the behavior that we want very important. So every click means every time you're giving a treat. Over time, once the behavior is known, you do not need to click every time, and as a result, you do not need to give a treat every time. But when you start a new behavior again, whatever it is, you're going to bring that clicker back out. But because the clicker was classically conditioned, the dog's probably going to know right off the bat again what it's doing and that they're beginning the game again. So this often brings in a question of when do I actually add in a cue? Humans are really talkative people. We use the English language, or a variety of language, often in our repertoire of speaking. However, as we all should know, dogs do not have English or any language, speaking language, as their first language. So as a result, they often are hearing all these auditory noises that really mean nothing to them and or which they choose to ignore. So that's why cues are really important. We want dogs to know that and know the importance of them. So we don't want to necessarily repeat cues and we don't want them to be ignored. So this is somewhat of a facetious thing. Obviously the dog is hinting that it doesn't actually know its name because it hears get down, no more often than its name. So when we add a cue, I often tell people that I only add a cue when the dog is actually offering me the behavior often enough. I'm not going to tell a dog that I've never worked with, that's a new puppy or even an adolescent that probably has no learning history. I'm not going to tell them right off the bat, sit, because that word means to them, I'm ignoring this, it means nothing, it's just an arbitrary sound that's coming from this person's mouth. So I'll only add a cue when the dog is actually offering me behaviors enough, right? We're in that capturing state when the dog is getting primed and motivated to sit when it's getting a treat. After the dog has offered it enough times and in enough sequence, then essentially I'll add a sit. So essentially the dog starts doing that slow descent into the sit position as we've all seen dogs do. And essentially right before butt hits the ground, I'll say sit. And essentially I like to think about it as you're essentially labeling that behavior for the animal. Hey, that behavior that you've been offering me and that you've been getting really good rewards for, this is what is called sit. And as a result, when you ask it, then gets cued into, oh, I hear that word, I know what that means, it means butt to ground, let me do that. So that's that concept of cue. And it's really important we only use it in the correct context and in the correct environments. A new puppy that has known sit in a house environment is not going to be ready to do sit on Fifth Avenue, as I used to tell my New York clients, right? Home is the most boring environment where you can get behaviors. Bringing them to a new distracting environment, a lot of those cues are going to go out the window until you're really primed and ready to be focused on that in those environments. Similarly, a lot of cues get what we call poisoned, right? We overuse them and the dog learns to ignore them, or you put them in different contexts. So come is actually a really commonly ignored cue because it gets used in multiple contexts, right? We want come to be really freaking important for our animals that we are working with. And a lot of times, because we just randomly let out words out of our mouth, we're actually confounding that word. So sometimes dogs hear come and they get to go to the dog park or get to go on a walk or they get lunch. And sometimes dogs hear come and they're leaving the dog park or they're getting a bath, right? And so that gets mixed up in their brain of, well, sometimes that's a good word and sometimes it's a bad word, so maybe I'll ignore it this time. And that always adds into people, well, how do I actually get my dog to come to go to the bathroom to get a bath? I also tell them, just get your dog and bring a treat. Your dog will survive and you don't need to add any other words into that context. Use of rewards. This is really important to think about here in a shelter environment because as much as the animals are going out and getting exercise, it is likely less than what they are getting in a home environment. They're also seeing a lot more people who can give them rewards than what they might be seeing in a home environment. So the use of rewards we really need to be diligent about. And the first thing that is really important to think about is what is a rewarding depends on what is important to the dog. We had a dog at our Redwood City location that was very, very shut down and very under-socialized. That dog hated human touch. And that has to take into effect because for humans, touch we see as really rewarding, right? Oh, a dog loves petting, it must always be petting. So a lot of times people will get into this mentality with dogs like this dog that we had at Redwood City that as long as I am petting it, the dog will feel my touch and it will be happy and it will get over this, right? Well, no, for this dog, it was literally a punishment every time someone came in the room and touched it. So it really was doing counterintuitive to what the humans thought was happening. A lot of times we think about reward as being food rewards, and foods definitely have a value system. I might be happy to eat Cheerios every day, but I'll definitely be happier if one day I get, Lucky Charms. That is important to think about. We describe sometimes a value system of treats for animals. Most of the time, low value is something that they get all the time, right? They're Cheerios. It's going to be the kibble. They'll eat it. Some dogs might be excited about the kibble when they get it for breakfast and dinner, but it's not as exciting as treats that they might get at the pet store, right? Some of those meaty treats, anything like that. Those are what we would call medium value treats. And then you get up into high value treats, right? And those are treats that you're going to use when you're working on something that might be difficult for the dog or when the distraction level is high. High value treats, you're often getting into the pure meat or pure dairy products. You're getting into treats like, boiled chicken, deli meats. You're getting into string cheese, you're getting into cream cheese, you're getting into a variety of cheeses, peanut butter, all those kinds of things are usually high value for the dog. But then again, some dogs don't like peanut butter. So once again, it comes back to that saliency factor. I often joke and say that I had a client in New York City that was in a reactive dog class. So that's a very stressful environment with lots of distractions for this particular dog. And they needed to have high value treats. And I poked my head over one time in the class and I looked and I saw a bunch of feta and watermelon on the ground. And I asked the owner, I said, "Are you kidding me?" And she said, "No, feta and watermelon was the highest value thing for this bulldog," which she obviously went through many permutations of different rewards that were for her dog. And this is what she settled on. So it all does depend on the personality of the dog. And food is obviously a very high rewarding item for animals, but it's important for us to think about, especially in the shelter environment, as I mentioned, where exercise is not happening as often as it could be, and they're already having their meals met, that we don't necessarily want our dogs to get overweight. So rewards can also be movement, it can be play, it can be praise, it can be petting. That being said, praise and petting are pretty low on the scale, but some dogs are super motivated by movement and toys, and that's totally fine to utilize instead of treats. There's also this concept in the dog training world of the Premack principle, which in layman's terms can essentially be thinking of your eat your vegetables. Is it more likely that you're going to want to eat ice cream or you're going to want to eat your vegetables? Well, it's much more likely that you're going to want to eat ice cream, but in order to get the ice cream, you need to do the unlikely behavior first, which is eating your vegetables. So this is a lot of times, and most people do this default nowadays, but it is important to always remember, right? The dog wants to go out for a walk. Well, I'm going to have them sit first. The dog wants to jump in my lap. It's going to have to sit first. That's a really basic thing that I think is really important to institute in the shelter environment when you're going out for walks or when you're interacting with the animals. A lot of dogs that end up in the shelter world have impulse control problems, which basically means their brains are just going, accelerating to infinity, and they're not really getting times to think back and contemplate their decisions. So having things like the Premack principle, where they have to kind of take a step back and think through their actions, is really important and can really help with those impulse control items, and you're not adding food into that context. So for example, I could take a dog for a walk that launches itself at the front of the cage, is pulling me down the hallway, and is racing and barking at everything as we go on a walk. Yes, I got the animal out, I got the exercise that it needed, and I did that check mark. But it's not benefiting the animal. A better way to do that would be, the dog has to sit or have 4 on the floor before I enter the kennel. It has to sit while I put its harness on. It has to sit before I open the door, and then we go out. In all those contexts, no other treats are added into that, right? The reward is the going outside. The reward is I get to put the leash on you and we're gonna go outside, right? There's no treats added into that context. You are just using the reward of the movement X to do that. In New York City, where pigeons are plenty, we often would use this for animals that were prey reactive, right? It's kind of hard to walk in New York City without seeing pigeons, and if you have a dog that likes to pull towards pigeons, it can make walking really hard. So what we would often do is use the Premack principle in order to help make walks easier. So basically, every time a dog saw a pigeon, instead of doing the likely scenario, which would be I'm going to launch forward and try to eat the pigeon, we would try to train it so that it would have to sit and then look at the handler, and then we would play the game of, oh my God, quote unquote, let's chase and catch the pigeon, which of course we never caught the pigeon, but the dog didn't know that, and that was part of the game, right? The dog had to take a step back and think through its actions rather than acting like a lunatic, which can happen to teenage and adolescent dogs. All right, now this concept of counter conditioning and desensitization is a really important aspect to take into the shelter environment. We talk about counter conditioning, and really what we mean by that is counter classical conditioning, right? And so this goes back into these concepts of fears. The animal might have a classical conditioned response to person in, baseball hat or skateboard or anything like that. And essentially through training, we want to counter classical condition that. So oftentimes we're using that with food rewards or distance away. So we are counteracting that by pairing it with something else. So instead of the dog reacting and barking and lunging every time it skates a skateboard, well, now we're going to change that. So every time a skateboard comes, we're going to give that dog peanut butter. So now the skateboard means peanut butter is coming, as opposed to, oh my God, I need to get really worked up and freaked out. And this is a really important thing because you're getting to that emotional core of the animal. A nameless television trainer uses a different concept of what we call flooding. And it's a lot of times really good for media purposes and for people that a lot of times think I need a reaction and a fix fast, and flooding can help you do that. But the problem with flooding is that you're not getting to that emotional core. So if you were scared of snakes and I threw you in a pit of snakes, over time you are going to stop screaming. And someone might say that, oh my God, we cured them. They stopped reacting to the snakes. Look at how they're tolerating that situation. However, if you walk out of there and a snake falls on your head, you are probably going to scream and yell, and you're not going to be calm about it because you've only taken you out of that situation where you were overwhelmed by it, but you haven't changed that emotional response. And counter conditioning is really important, but you also have to pair it with slow and gradual progress. You can't do one incidence of pairing a skateboard to peanut butter and say that the dog is totally cured. That's just as guilty as being flooding an animal and saying that you cured the animal. So counter conditioning and desensitization get paired a lot because essentially you're counteracting every conditioned response the animal has, but you're doing it in gradual steps over time. So for example, one of the clients that you saw that I had in my picture earlier, the Shepherd mix, hated skateboards. Rudy really dislikes skateboards, and it's kind of hard to counteract that in a controlled environment where he lived in Brooklyn, where skateboards were randomly appearing at all times. However, he did happen to live next to a skate park. So part of our training sessions would be going to the skate park, and at first we started at a far distance, and then we gradually got closer and closer and closer. And every time he heard a skateboard noise, which was his reaction, it was less of the movement, it was more the noise, he got some turkey. And then as we got closer, he had heard the noise, he got some turkey. Eventually we got to a spot where we actually had him refuse to leave the skate park because he knew the skate park equaled turkey. And he didn't want to leave the skate park because he knew it meant less turkey. So we actually effectively counter-conditioned him to the skate park to the point where he refused, which is just part and parcel to that special dog that he was, that I love and miss very much. But that is kind of that goal that you have for counter-conditioning, is that your dog gets to the point where they're comfortable and happy being in the environment with something that used to scare them. Okay, dog body language and displacement signals. Dog body language is a very complex thing. As I mentioned earlier, dogs do not speak verbal language, and a lot of that is part and parcel to their body language. And there's different scales to body language, and displacement is kind of that first rung that I think it's really important to be mindful of within dogs. So you can see kind of some different contexts here. You can see here you have this whale eye. You're looking at this eye right here where you can see the whites of their eye. That is a displacement signal. You can kind of imagine that the dog is looking but not really looking at something, and its head's in position but it's trying to look away. Here you can see this dog doing the lip lick, and if you assume that the dog did not have a delicious snack right before that, that is a displacement signal. The dog is displaying some level of discomfort for whatever situation just happened. And here, this is what we would call an active appeasement behavior, right? The dog has a really low body, the tongue is out right here, eyes are closed and eyes are squinty. That's what we call an active appeasement behavior. You can kind of imagine the dog thinking to itself, oh, I kind of want to approach the person, but I'm kind of unsure, and the guy's hand's over my head, but I want to be nice and I want to approach, right? Those are all displacement signals. And the displacement signals are important for us to take stock of because they're indicating that the dog is experiencing some level of discomfort and anxiety in the situation. And that is how they're releasing that stress. I relate it to humans when we're feeling stressed and we kind of go, right? We do a big exhale and we breathe out. That is essentially what our dogs are doing, displacement signals. Even going so far as to a shake-off behavior, that is a displacement signal. So context when you might see this, right? You might see this if there's a loud noise that is being played. You might see this if a dog greets another dog on the street and then they separate and then they both shake off. Sometimes you see this as kind of frustration behavior in training. I used to see this a lot with some of my puppies where I would be kind of waiting to capture a behavior of a sit, and the dog would kind of just look at me and then all of a sudden scratch its ear or smell itself, right? The dog is basically going, I don't really know what you want. I'm feeling kind of weird in this situation, so I'm going to do something else. So these are really important first baseline behaviors to look out for animals because it can help us move forward in our understanding of how you should proceed with this behavior, right? If the dog is indicating that it didn't like this greeting X amount of time, well, you can go back and change it another time. If you saw the vacuum and the dog kind of started shaking off or lip licking or yawning, well, the next time if I have to vacuum, then maybe I'll bring treats and change that response. It was really important to stress to people that while displacement signals are really important and good to take stock of, it's not something that should paralyze you in moving forward with your life. It's showing that the dog has an ability to cope, and that's a really important thing to take stock of. Is the difference between stress and distress is the ability to cope. Any dog trainer will tell you that the dog that is most concerning to them is not the dog that is barking or growling, it's the dog that gives no signals at all. That dog is essentially an automaton, and you can almost think of it as it's bottling up all its behavior. It's not giving you any signals, and that is the most concerning, because that means the dog doesn't really have that ability to cope or express anything, and thus it might react in ways that we don't necessarily want. Another important thing about dog body language is the tail position. I hope at this point in your lives, and if not, I am sharing this information to you, that a wagging tail does not always mean that the dog is happy and friendly. Tails are a really important aspect of dog behavior, but it's not the end-all be-all. So if I see a dog that's wagging its tail, but the rest of its body is stiff, that's a concerning dog to me, right? I'm not going to proceed and expect that the dog is really excited to see me. And you can see over here, you have this bulldog, and you can see, you know, its tail is up, but you can also see that its body position is pretty much facing forward. So likely that's telling me that this dog is alert and it's looking at something off in the distance. On the other side, this hound dog over here is what we would call is pretty normal conformation. You can see that its tail is pretty in line with what we would call the length of its back. It's not up and it's not necessarily down. So it's probably just kind of scoping out, hanging out in the yard, and it's not too concerned. You can see its mouth is pretty, soft, and its ears are just kind of hanging out there. Now, an important thing to take stock of when we're talking about, body position and tail position is also to take stock in what type of dog we're actually looking at. Things like a bulldog, things like French bulldogs, English bulldogs. I have had so many clients come up to me and go, my dog hates Frenchies, my dog hates bulldogs. And I tell them, I said, well, when you look at them, do you even think they look like dogs, right? And I say this with utmost kindness, considering that I have lots of my favorite clients in New York City were French bulldogs, but objectively, they do not look like your prototypical dog when you think of it, right? They have bulging eyeballs, they don't have much of a muzzle, they don't have tails, and they're built like fullbacks, right? And so their body language that they're presenting to other dogs who may or may not have been socialized to dogs like them is not reading often like a regular dog. And so that all ties into this body language that dogs are perceiving from other dogs that might not fall into the category of what a dog looks like because they're really hard to read. They're not giving much body movement, they're not giving any tail movement, and their ears are often pricked and their face don't show the no more commissures that happen on a muzzle. Another thing that's really important to think about with body language in dogs is the object of rear sniffing. That is obviously not how humans or primates smell and greet each other, but this is normal dog body language. And one of the things that's really important to think about is the context in which most of us are going to be interacting with dogs is going to be inhibiting this. So when we walk dogs, we're pretty inherently restricting the idea of rear sniffing. When you see dogs in dog parks, you see that nice C body language, right? They're both curled around and they're both smelling their rear ends. A lot of that is inhibited when dogs are on walks. And that's often when you'll see something that we call leash reactivity. I don't necessarily like to call it leash aggression because it doesn't necessarily mean the dog's aggressive. It just means that there's reactivity on leash, and often that's tied into frustration, in part because this rear sniffing is inhibited. The dogs are on a 6-foot leash. They are walking straight often into the eyes of another dog, and dogs do not look at each other in the eyes. That's a very confrontational position. So you're kind of setting a dog up for failure because it can't get away and it also can't move forward. You're looking at another dog in the eyes, a dog that you may or may not be interested in greeting. And then when you might actually ultimately get up and close, leashes can get tangled, the other dog might not be interested, and then you get something that is the leash reactivity. So it either could be frustration because they're acting like lunatics and they really want to say hi to the other dog, or it could truly be aggression. I had so many people in New York City tell me that their dog was friendly on leash, and I really should have done my master's project on that, but there's no way in heck that 99% of the people in New York City with their dogs have friendly animals. It's important to think about when you're walking a dog that saying that your dog is friendly means friendly to all dogs, friendly to senior dogs, friendly to puppies, friendly to fluffy dogs, friendly to short-haired dogs, friendly to senior dogs, friendly to all. There's so many different parameters that it's not possible that a dog is going to be friendly to all of them. So as a result, both for the shelter animals and as I would recommend in private practice, I would defer to not do leash greetings on walks. So obviously when you are walking shelter dogs for pets in need, that is a definite no. You are just going to be strictly walking your dog. You are not going to encourage your dog that you are walking to greet other dogs on leash, as well as members of the public, just because the leash can add a lot of inhibition, add a lot of control issues for an animal. But that being said, I'm not an idiot, and I do understand that sometimes accidental greetings do occur. So if you happen to run into a dog on your walk, I encourage you to do kind of what we call a 3-second greeting. Now, this isn't a scientifically proven number. It's just kind of an arbitrary number that trainers have kind of put out to allow the dogs to sniff, and then they can go away. And sometimes the dog might not want to go away, so you add movement into that, and fast movement and happy talking and all that kind of fun stuff to encourage your dog to move away. So, it's 1, 2, 3, sniff, and then, oh, okay, let's go. And then we kind of run away, we jog away, and then we get a treat, right? So you're kind of hopefully decreasing that whole frustration that might occur with the dog additionally getting pulled away when it might have been wanting to be in that area. So I know this says body language, but vocalizations are part of dog language as well. So this is a really important and critical thing that I want volunteers to recognize with our animals, as well as important to recognize for the general public. So there's this concept that's been going around in the positive reinforcement training world called don't punish the growl. And really the crux of this is that the growl is providing information to us about how the dog feels comfortable about a certain situation. I approach the dog growls rather than punishing it, which is a very human concept to go, growls are mean, growl means the dog's mean, and I don't want that to happen. You can take that as, okay, I acknowledge that you're growling, you're clearly not comfortable in the situation, I will back off. And why that is beneficial and why we don't want to punish the growl is because we want to encourage the dog to provide us information that we can read. So if a dog growls and it gets punished, what's going to happen? The dog is going to say, well, this is a useless tool in my toolbox and I'm not going to utilize it anymore. And so what can happen is the dog will escalate up what they call the canine ladder of aggression, which you can see here. So you can see here on the bottom level where these colors are, is that these are what we were talking about earlier, right? These are those displacement signals. The dog is indicating some type of discomfort. I'm not happy in the situation. I'm trying to avoid it. I'm going to do a displacement signal. So this is why it is important that you actually look at those displacement signals and take stock of them. And then you move up the ladder, they get a little bit more obvious, right? There's still what we would somewhat categorize as displacement signals or more active movements. Moving away, the ears or the head back. This is what we would call passive appeasement. That's kind of a mixed bag, so you can ignore that. But this is escalating up the canine ladder to where we get to a point where the dog is growling, right? And as you can see, that surprisingly is really high up the ladder. So that's why we really want the dog to basically stop here. We don't want the dog to go past the growling point, because where does that go? That leads us to bites. So that's where we go back to the don't punish the growl. Is we want our dogs to say, okay, growl is the last thing that I'll do. I won't move past it. Don't worry about it. But sometimes what happens is if a dog gets punished often enough, and once again, there's no magic number of it's 5 times, it's 10 times, that is based on the personality of the dog will then snap or bite, right? Because it's basically said, hey, this is no longer an option anymore. I really want to get my point across. I'm going to escalate. And what's important for us to think about in the training world and in the dog behavior world is once a dog has chosen this, this is now going to be its #1 choice. it is no longer going to resort back to a growl, because why? That growl has proven that it wasn't effective all those times previously. And bites for humans are very effective information that a dog can provide us. So therefore the dog's going to use that as its main choice, because the dog is no longer going to have to resort back to the growl, which was ineffective. Bites are more energy, they're more efficient, they're not wasting as much energy, and it gets the point across really fast. So all of this being said, this implies, as soon as I teach you all of this, I tell you ignore it. No, I don't. All of this being said, the ladder is what we would define as a normal progression. When you're working with dogs in the shelter environment, it doesn't necessarily mean the dog is going to go up this scale normally. It also doesn't mean that a dog is going to always resort to a bite after a growl, right? Some dogs will actually never progress beyond the stand and crouch. And that plays into socialization history, and that also plays into genetics, right? Some dogs have less ability to cope, and so their first line of defense might be the stiffen and stare. They might not have ever shown these displacement behaviors, and that might be just because they're the genetics. It might be a combination of genetics and socialization history, where these got punished very early on in their lives, and so they just resorted to these things first. And so that's all very important to be mindful of when you're interacting with the shelter animals, and what information the training and the staff is telling you when we're telling you to interact with these animals. A note on dominance. So this is a little pet peeve of mine, and I think it's really important to discuss in relation to our positive reinforcement and force-free philosophy. We can all kind of laugh at this image. There's no way that we see a Chihuahua and immediately think it's a wolf. However, that's where this dominance theory originated from, and even though it's debunked, it still exists in the dog training world, primarily by that nameless television dog trainer. So the story of this dominance theory in animal behavior and dog behavior originated from a study that was done back in the 50s or 60s, where a researcher studied a captive wolf population and saw what he defined as clearly hierarchical structures within the captive wolf group, right? There was clearly an alpha, there was clearly a beta that was below it, there was clearly all these factors that went into it, and the alpha's role never changed, and it was in existence for perpetuity and all that kind of stuff. For whatever reason, that continued on within the dog training world. Years passed, and that same researcher actually came out and said, as anyone in science would tell you, oh, oops, I was wrong. I learned more information, and please disregard that. And what the new science is telling us is that dominance actually is a very flexible and context-specific role. It really depends on the other players that are in there. So what's an important takeaway in terms of the dog world is that dominance is not a personality trait. You are not going to define a dog as dominant. A dog might act more confident or assertive in certain situations, but that dog as itself is not set in stone personality trait dominant. And in part of this whole concept of dominant is really changes the hierarchical structure within the families that are adopting the dogs that we want. And here at Pets in Need, we're really trying to make it important for the animals that they're going into a family environment. And if the family has this hierarchical mindset in their mind of I must dominate my dog, you're already changing that hierarchical relationship between the dog and the animal. The saddest thing that I ever heard in New York City was, clients that really wanted a dog to sit on the couch with them or sleep in bed with them. And they would say, well, I don't want my dog to think I'm dominant. And that's a really big pitfall that many people fall into, is giving your dog 1 ounce of leniency is going to make your dog dominant over you, and it's going to overtake the world, Pinky and the brain status, right? There's a strict difference between allowing your dog to sleep on your bed, and this is coming from me who sleeps on my bed with my 2 60-pound dogs. There's a difference between allowing your dog to sleep on your bed and allowing your dog to sleep on your bed and eat off your counters and drink out of your toilet and drag you down the street, right? There are different management strategies. If I walked into someone's house and they said my dog is dominant over me and I saw that they had no management strategy set in place, I still wouldn't fall into and say, yes, your dog is dominant. No, you have a management problem. You are setting your dog up for failure in your mind because you're letting your dog run free. That's the concept why we have leashes, right? We have leashes to allow for proper management. Every dog in the entire world would be defined as dominant if we didn't have leashes, because it's never going to come back to you and it's going to run around and do whatever we want. A really interesting, even though dog parks can be a mess, a really interesting thing that I encourage people to sometimes look at if they're around a bunch of dogs that are playing off leash together is to look at the dynamics that happen, right? And in dog parks, you're often hearing people describe this alpha and dominant mentality the most, but if you're actually looking at the dog behavior, you'll actually see that that is changeable over time. And sometimes new dogs come in and the hierarchy changes and one dog is now playing more with another when it wasn't playing with that dog before. That is what we're talking about when we're talking about this flexibility of this dominant hierarchy. Hierarchies do exist within dogs. Humans just do not factor into it. And that is an important thing to take stock of. So how to handle nipping. Nipping is something that we're going to have, that's going to happen a lot when you're working with puppies. It's also going to happen on the mouthing side of things when you're working with adolescent dogs here at Pets in Need that maybe have not had that impulse control that we talked about previously. So this is where that concept of negative punishment comes into play. We have to always be aware of how the dogs are actually perceiving what we are presenting. And that really takes into stock what we define as punishing and what the dog actually feels is punishing, right? So the example I often give and what a lot of people think about is, you know, a dog biting me, right? And some people, the jury is out on whether this was a wholly, you know, given example of how to handle nipping, but I used to hear it a lot that if a dog was nipping, you wanted to emit a high-pitched squeal because that's exactly what puppies do to other puppies in order to give each other bite inhibition, right? Oh, the other puppy will let them know if it's too much pressure. Well, two things with that. I have definitely seen puppies dragging other puppies by the neck or ear in puppy playtime, and neither of them are screaming. So that is kind of like the blind leading the blind. A lot of times puppies don't actually know bite inhibition to give to the other puppy. So a lot of times squealing doesn't actually happen. And secondly, we are constantly reinforcing dogs all the time to bite down hard and to squeak with squeaky toys. So if you are trying to stop a puppy from biting on you by emitting a high-pitched squeal, you're only potentially reinforcing that behavior that the dog is wanting. You've giantly turned yourself into a giant squeaky toy. So this is where the negative punishment comes into play, where the most punishing thing that you could possibly give a puppy who often is nipping you because they are exploring with their mouth and wanting to get more attention and affection and just don't know how to properly do it, is actually to walk away and move away, right? There's this concept that they talk about in the training world, often given to kids, is this concept called be a tree, right? Dog jumps up on you, you're just gonna act totally shut down and non-responsive. Dog jumps up and I push on my hands, I'm still giving that dog some level of feedback of attention. Dog is nipping and I push on the dog or I move it away, that's still some feedback. So oftentimes it's either be totally boring and non-reactive in response to the nipping to the dog, or you do something called redirection. And I really encourage people when they're working with puppies to come armed with many, many types of toys of different fashions. And that's where that redirecting comes into play, right? The dog starts going for my hand, well, I'm just gonna shove an appropriate chew toy into its mouth. And so it's directed to the right item of what to do. And that is really important and kind of the basics of what I would encourage for handling nipping. So how to clean basins, socializing dogs. So this kind of covers both areas of Redwood City and Palo Alto. They are both different locations, but at a very basic level, Remember to either sanitize or clean your hands in between visits. That is the most common form of spreading disease, and we are the most common transmitters of disease between dogs, so it's important that we be mindful of it. There are hand sanitizer stations throughout the shelter in both locations. You are obviously always welcome to also use the bathrooms and actually physically wash your hands. At our Redwood City location, we have a meet and greet room that are sometimes used for socializing or adoption interactions. I always encourage people to reach out to the kennel staff in order to help them disinfect the room prior to bringing another dog in, especially if it's a puppy. Here at our Palo Alto location, if you're using the yard outside, I do encourage you to be mindful and hose down after an animal urinates or defecates in the yard, because that's going to be spread. And in both locations, be mindful of the toys you're using and to swap out toys, because that's a really easy way to spread infection too, right? Sneezy dog chewing on a toy can easily spread to another dog.